Welcome back and thanks for staying with the SABC. So the conversation around coalitions has mainly been dominated by the big three, if you like, creating some kind of impression that there's no consideration for smaller parties. Mmusi Maimane's Build One South Africa got 0.4% of the national vote. That's earned the organization 2 seats in parliament. Maimane joins us now via our video link for more on his take around the machinations, as they call them. Mmusi Maimane, it's great to have you on the SABC. Thanks very much indeed for making time to speak to us. And I suppose congratulations are in order. 2 seats in the National Assembly. That's certainly more than what other people who are vying for this election have been able to earn. Has anybody reached out to speak about any kind of coalition with BOSA?
Fellow South Africans, we have been very intentional about what this election means for this nation. This election requires a sense of patriotism, a sense upon which all of us say we serve the 60 million South Africans. When anyone has reached out to us, we've been very clear that it's not just forming a government, but it's also ensuring that there's a sensible opposition, that opposition is able to hold whichever government in place to account. And certainly from BOSA's point of view, we've held the view that says that it's going to be important that we look at the agenda of the government. And if the agenda of the government is aligned to our vision, to our values, it is certainly one that we could either participate in or hold accountable. And secondly, more than anything, we've got to remind ourselves that the parliament is an authority of this country and the constitution, the supreme law. Therefore, we've got to ensure that those 2 principles are upheld in making sure that we steer the interest of all South Africans through both those instruments. And so from our perspective, this is a moment in our nation that we need leadership, and that's why tomorrow I welcome the opportunity. We'll be meeting with all the leaders of parties to say, let's not discuss positions, let's not discuss anything, but let's discuss values, let's discuss constitutionalism, let's discuss ultimately a pathway for government, because when we do that, we can be able to achieve a sense upon which both the government and the opposition are held in good stead.
Yeah. Given what's already in the public domain, it seems that in the main there are kind of 3 main options. One, right? Conversations around a coalition, a grand coalition with one of the organizations and the ANC, the prospects of a government of national unity, and conversations around a minority government. Given your own experience about how Parliament works and the important position of Parliament in society, as you've mentioned, what do you reckon is the optimal solution here?
I think, whilst there is no easy option, all options are faced with difficulties and things that you're going to have to let go of. I certainly do think that a grand coalition of some sort, where ultimately you can have a combination of the big parties, but you need more than that. Because what will happen in that instance is that you don't want a contestation between, for example, the DA or the ANC at one, because I think it doesn't help both accountability and governance. Because what you don't want is also to say what then becomes of the official opposition, because that's also an important role in government to make sure that this government has got change. So that probably is about the best option. And I think that what we've got to do is create a pipeline of accountability, because governments of national unity, as the ANC has positioned it at the moment, have also had what Zimbabwe had in 2007, where it had a government of national unity. And when we look at where Zimbabwe is at today, that's where we sit. Our position is straightforward. We will be sitting with all the opposition leaders tomorrow. We'll have a conversation about how do we set up both an opposition, and furthermore, how we hold government to account. And wherever there are people invited to serve in cabinet or in government, we will certainly be open to those pending on the plan. So the best solution at this point in time is that we create an appropriate coalition of broader parties, more than just the top 3, so that we always have a space upon which there's a voice for South Africans to be able to express their views, so that it stops becoming a settling of scores between parties, as it were.
Speaking of that, of course, the ANC in some ways sets the tone for how all of this will unfold because of the fact that they did receive the most amount of votes, even though they didn't get an outright majority. Lutuli House saying yesterday that the MK party is essentially giving them the cold shoulder. My words, not theirs. But when you think about, this idea of settling scores and the like, can you envision any kind of government being put together without the MK party, given the fact that it's the largest in the country at the moment? Or third largest?
The pronouncements by MK, where they say they don't believe in the constitution of this country, or that the constitution must be removed, must be cause for concern. There are deficits within the constitution. Some of them are not intrinsic to the constitution. Some of them are given by the fact that there's been poor governance, poor legislative framework emanating from that. And so the natural, easy thing is to blame the constitution. But I think the constitution still acts as our guiding light, and we mustn't steer away from that. So therefore, how do you govern with a party that doesn't believe in the constitution? It makes that whole situation one that is without laws, that will make sure that this country regresses back to perhaps a period where we weren't a constitutional democracy. And nations, for example, Israel, as an example, doesn't have a constitution, and yet you can see all the riots that have been taking place and all the difficulties that has ensued. So we cannot regress back to that at this point in time. Therefore, I can't see a combination where the MK party is part of the government in that regard, because it would be a government that needs to be configured differently. Otherwise, you must concede that there's no constitutional order. So let's set that option aside and work with what we have and what is possible within our constitutional framework.
And what's to be said about the 2.2 million plus people who voted for MK?
I respect the choices of South Africans. MK is a party. I don't agree with what they say, but it is a party. They will come to parliament. They have to recognize that they haven't garnered a majority to remove the constitution. So to the voters who have voted for the MK party, you must realize that you'll be coming to a constitutional democracy led by a parliament, and the members of parliament needs to come in and understand how we steer the interests of the country. I do think the next 5 years are going to be crucial, and my call still remains that even if they may in campaigning have said many things, but we need to ensure that they come back into a space where they realize that this country is led by a democracy, by a constitution, and we must work together to be able to steer the interest of all South Africans. It's not just the 2.2 million people who voted for them. And all of these continuous threats of violence are not helping this country. What we need is actually to stop thinking in selfish manners and answer the basic question. How do we spearhead the interest of 60 million South Africans? Yeah. That's the only question on the table. Anything else is selfish, petty politics that will lead this nation to greater divisions.
Sure. Even the question you put on the table, I think, is very difficult to answer, right? Because the interests of South Africans are not a unified kind of thing, right? South Africa is a homogenous society. People actually have conflicting interests. And in the main, we get the impression that there are people who are suggesting that there's an outcome of these negotiations that will kind of appease the markets. That speaks to the kind of grand coalition that you also alluded to with the DA possibly. And there is an option that goes the other side, so to speak, for lack of a better term, where the ANC would perhaps have a partnership with the EFF and maybe if MK eventually comes around. In your mind, are the options that simple? Is it either or is there some kind of way of being able to appease the markets, whoever they are, and also being able to speak to the constituency and make sure that the core base of these parties agree with the outcome?
In some ways, this is where maybe historically President Zuma understood this problem, that there needed to be a combination of social stability in the country, and there needs to be a consideration of market favorability. Both those are variables in society, but you can't pick one over the other. You can't just say if the markets want this, therefore that's what government will configure, because as important as that variable is, it is only but a variable, and it speaks to an ideological lens. My other thinking is to say that it is possible to create a coalition and then invite other parties to take up more senior leadership in government, so that you've got more and more people, and a combination of both. How do you keep the country socially stable with relations that make sure there's security, that the poor are looked after, but also advance an economic plan that goes to ensure that our market sustainability is important, that the currency is stabilized, etc. I think there is a combination to be able to achieve that. It will require, as I say, it cannot just be narrowly DA-ANC. It has to be broader and include more members of parliament, because when you achieve that, you can be able to have other voices. For example, it'd be important who you choose as Minister of Finance. It'd be important who you choose as the leader of the economics cluster. It'll be important, for argument's sake, who you appoint as Deputy President or even the position of President, because all of those things symbolize, both to the market and to the country, that their will has been expressed. What we also mustn't lose track of in this scenario is that whilst I hear everyone saying the ANC is the largest party, but South Africans, 60% of them voted against the ANC. And there must be a sense upon which that reality also sinks into the ANC itself. That it can't just continue business as usual and hope that South Africans must save buttress it so that it remains in government. We must also recognize the importance of this moment and say, if South Africans are asking for change, given the last 5 years or given the last 15 years, including President Zuma's terms, that there's been load shedding, there's been unemployment, there's been all of those things. So we've got to come up with a plan with leaders who will achieve sustainable growth, inclusion, and stability. That's the stability we are looking for. And I think that to be always permanently going, well, only the ANC can do that, given that they're the biggest, would be a misnomer in the sense that they've delivered the last 15 years of fairly mediocre growth and poor governance.
Something has to be said about who leads these discussions, and I suppose that's where the ANC's role is being assigned, if you know what I mean. But I wonder, because a lot of the focus has been on the national government and the National Assembly, and I think that has its place, but also at a provincial level, there are also interesting dynamics to be negotiated. BOSA has a seat in Gauteng, the Gauteng legislature. Are those discussions any easier, do you think, or is it really much of the same?
No, I think in many ways, once we get the broad national framework, and we'll be able to distill further down where we go. For me, it's the same for Gauteng. Let's find a combination that achieves 5% GDP growth. Let's educate our kids. Let's keep our streets safe, and let's ensure that ultimately we ensure that there's an ethical leadership that's in place. Those are our conditions. But even if they weren't for us to be negotiating on, I think it'll be important for whatever government comes into play to do that. And Gauteng must be able to steer guard that. And I think that ultimately let's appoint a premier who will embody those values. Let's create a supportive government, even if it's not formalized coalitions, that ensure that Gauteng's economic prospects are steered in that way, and so will be the national ones. And then let's take the conversation further from there. I think that at this point must be the objective. If it's about parties and parties' interests, I really think it will set this country back. And then 2029 becomes an impossible project, given lower voter turnout this year and more citizens not believing that change is possible.
Sure, I shudder at the thought of what that looks like. Mmusi Maimane, thanks very much indeed. A little birdie tells me it's also your birthday today, so I hope whatever outcome there is on the other side of this, it's a good wish for the good Muruti. Thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Mmusi Maimane is the leader of Build One South Africa.